All right, here we go. We're in chapter 1. We're examining specifically what are known as the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and what are called the southern colonies. Specifically today on our vocab chart, though, we talked about religious groups in the first category that is there. Now, our first question of the day was this: why did so many people want to come to what we call the United States today? We said that over in Europe there was a reform movement known as the Protestant Reformation that really rattled Europe, and it sent groups of people, some of them into seclusion where they were scared to express or practice their faith, while it sent others out to go find somewhere else to practice their faith or have what is known as religious freedom. So the first group that we talked about today were called the Pilgrims, along with a later group who came and settled in the same region known as Massachusetts. That was the Puritans. Both groups wanted to escape England because they could not change the practices of what was now called the Church of England, and they were discriminated against, they were persecuted, and they hoped that the New World would provide a new opportunity. Well, when they got here, they wanted to create this perfect community, they called it a city upon a hill, where they could be an example and a light to the world. However, they set up a pretty rigid and strict religious culture. They weren't accepting of other opinions. They weren't accepting of other faiths. In fact, they didn't allow people. They did not practice what we would call religious tolerance. We kind of landed right on that, identifying, this first group of Puritans, and here's what we said. For our definition for Pilgrims and Puritans, we said that they were a religious group who settled in the New England region. They were a religious group who settled in the New England region to create a city upon a hill. To create a city upon a hill. Period. Now, if we kind of move over on your sheet to the right, you can see my term there is city upon a hill. I'll go a little deeper here into that. They believed that if they could multiply, if they could create this perfect religious community where they were able to curb behavior, where they were able to curb sin, where they were able to control and kind of micromanage. One of the most challenging things here was that there was a theocracy, meaning there was no separation of church and state. They were together as one, which limited large amounts of freedom for a lot of individuals. Of course, women were second-class citizens here as well. Besides that, they believed wholeheartedly that they could be a beacon of light to the world. Here's your definition. City upon a hill was a Puritan belief. It was a Puritan belief that they could be an example, and a light to the world. And a light to the world. Period. Of course, if you look up here with my red magnets, this is where they're going to settle. They reference this as New England, whereas they left Old England and they came here and settled in this region as well. Okay, my next term that's on the list here is called Anglicans. Our Anglicans weren't necessarily coming to the New World to escape religious freedom. If you recall in previous history, Henry VIII needed a divorce from his wife, had to separate from the Catholic Church and create a new church for England. He created what was called the Church of England. And through this Church of England, those mandatory followers of this faith were called Anglicans. It's the very group that the Puritans didn't want to be around. So they left. Well, we're going to see another group of Englanders, people from England, arrive in the New World, not for religious protection or religious freedom, but they're on the high quest of finding gold. A large component of these gold seekers arrive in a place that they call Jamestown. They named the territory, the grant, the charter was named the Land Virginia, and they settled in this region. And before long, Anglican churches are being built throughout not only Virginia, but throughout the south of Virginia, as far as North Carolina, South Carolina, and even into Georgia. This group of people basically copied and pasted the Anglican Church of England in this region of what we call the southern colonies. Here's your definition. The Anglicans settled in the southern colonies and supported the Church of England. The Anglicans settled in the southern colonies and supported the Church of England. All right, let's move over to the next side. Our term says Colonial Virginia. Now, Colonial Virginia is going to be our first successful English colony of Jamestown. The religious community there that took shape was a result of those gold seekers staying there and permanently creating a colony. Of course, it was not gold that makes Jamestown successful, as we'll find out. It is the cultivation of the tobacco crop that makes Jamestown successful. Regardless, because of their religious identity, they are connected to England more as the Puritans have separated themselves the best they could 3,000 miles away, and they are going to develop this loyalty. And in fact, in future chapters, we might even call some of them loyalists. But here's your definition for Colonial Virginia. Colonial Virginia was the place in which Anglicans settled and created the colony of Jamestown. It is the place in which Anglicans settled and created the colony of Jamestown. Period. My next term is the Quakers. My Quakers over here represent, color-wise, they represent what are blue. Okay? Now, if you notice here, there's blue and white here. I'll get to that in a minute. But my Quakers were a religious group who were in England, who were probably heavily persecuted, if we were to say the most. They were radical. They were called a radical sect. They believed in some extreme ideas that were contrary to the time. They opposed the institution of slavery. They opposed that women didn't have any rights. In fact, they believed everyone had an inner self or an inner being, and all could have salvation. All could have religion. They believed that religions should tolerate each other. What a radical idea in this time period to exist in England. But in fact, it couldn't coexist, so they had to leave. Through a proprietorship, through Lord William Penn, land was given to the individual. He came and settled this region right here. We will call it the Middle Colonies. Specifically, we will call it Pennsylvania, named after William Penn. But our Quakers will create this society of friends where they basically hang up a welcome sign. They says, if you've been kicked out of the Puritan New England, if you're tired of the Anglican ways, if you have a different religion, if you're of a different ethnic group, you're welcomed here. In fact, the most interesting part was that when they got here, even though the Quakers had already had ownership of the land, they paid for the land from the Native Americans that were also here during this time period as a sign of mutual respect, or as William Penn would say, a sign of showing love thy neighbor as thyself. Here's the definition. Quakers settled throughout the Middle Colonies. They settled throughout the Middle Colonies, and they practiced religious tolerance. Now, if you move over to the box on your, I guess it'd be your right, it would say religious tolerance, if you need to know how to spell it. They practice religious tolerance. Period. What is religious tolerance? Well, let's go ahead and get the definition. Religious tolerance was practiced by the Quakers in the Pennsylvania colony. It was practiced by the Quakers in the Pennsylvania colony to treat all religions, as equal or fair to practice. Period. My last term we got today were known as Huguenots. Now, if you look at my board here, my Huguenots represent the white magnates that are also here in the middle colonies. The only difference here with our Huguenots is the majority, if not all, of these Huguenots were from a different country. They were from France. In fact, the definition is French Protestant. These Huguenots came to the New World and they said, where do we go? We can't settle amongst the Anglicans. They have a anti-French sentiment from years of English and French fighting amongst themselves. We can't settle in the Puritan region because you have to be Puritan to settle there. Well, let's go somewhere where they tolerate other religions. And these Huguenots settled, and they lived amongst and throughout New York and throughout Pennsylvania and what we would call the New Jerseys and Delaware. They settled in this region and practiced their religion. Here's your definition. The Huguenots were French Protestants who settled throughout the middle colonies. They were French Protestants who settled throughout the middle colonies. Period. That wraps up our definitions of the day, specifically on religious colonial groups. We specifically looked at who they were, where they settled, and some of the impacts that they had on their settlements.